This is Inside Town Hall, a behind-the-scenes look at city government and the issues affecting you and your family.
Well, thank you for joining us for this episode of Inside Town Hall. I'm your host, Madeline Shields. Coming up in the program, we're going to talk about the process and the procedures for annexing property into the city limits. And if you've ever considered running for office, now might be your time. There are 4 city council seats open, as well as the mayor. We'll be back with those stories and much more in just a moment.
They're glowing beacons that light our way. Streetlights in the city of Sioux Falls illuminate our travels, brighten our roads, and keep us safe. So what do you do if you see a streetlight out or malfunctioning? The city of Sioux Falls has made it easy to report a problem in your community with the Streetlight Hotline at 373-6979 or log on to siouxfalls.org. Give them as much information as you can and crews will be out to fix the problem as soon as possible. Thank you for helping make Sioux Falls a better place to live.
The city of Sioux Falls has procedures to annexing property, and here to tell us all about it is City Councilor Greg Neitzert, and his guest is Mike Cooper, the Director of Planning and Zoning for the city of Sioux Falls. Thanks for joining us for Inside Town Hall. Let's talk a little bit about what is annexation.
Sure. Annexation is a process of growing the city, bringing land into the city limits. Typically, it's voluntary, where a developer will bring in farmland as an example, and they'll want to develop houses or new commercial. That's the vast majority of annexation. It's voluntary. And then there's another type, which is called involuntary, where the city petitions to bring land into the city. That happens very rarely. What we're looking at right now is we have issues where we've essentially grown around a lot of developments. And so they are now what we call pockets in the city. They're not in the city limits, but they're completely surrounded by the city limits. And the challenge has been, how can we look at bringing them in and bring them into the city to become taxpayers, and we can provide them city services and we can have orderly growth.
Okay, well let's turn to Mike Cooper, who is the Director of Planning and Zoning. Explain to us, what is the process for annexing these properties? And I guess I didn't know that the city could grow around a property and still not have that property in the city limits. Explain that a little.
Sure. Well, just to follow up on the Councilor's explanation, annexation is a term that we use as far as adding property in a municipal boundary or corporate limits. And the state law that we follow has been in the books for quite a few years that explains the process for both voluntarily doing it as well as allowing a municipality to initiate annexation. Right now we're just over 78 square miles of land area within our corporate limits. And obviously the city has grown incrementally over decades of history to get to that point. And as we look into the future, by the year 2040, we could be up as close to 120 square miles of land area. But it's important for people to understand that the growth of the city limits is not initiated by city government. It's typically, as Councilor said, initiated by developers or landowners that want to build houses or build businesses, or it might be a school property, whatever it might be. So the process of annexation is determined by state law as well as local city ordinances. And again, what we've determined is back in the 60s and 70s, when people chose to build homes, which they thought was way out of the edge of the city, and now we're coming up against those homes or those individual property owners or properties, and now we're trying to decide, okay, how do we deal with those? Property can be annexed, it just has to be contiguous to the city limits. And so that's why it could be contiguous, but there could still end up being these pockets or islands of unannexed land that we're facing with now.
And when we talk about contiguous, that means it has to touch, right?
Yes.
It has their property has to be right up against the city property.
Correct.
Correct. Mm-hmm. Okay, let's talk a little bit about some of the growth areas that we might be talking about. You talk about farm areas. You talk about areas that are already developed into housing. Mm-hmm. What are those developments lacking that the city could change or give them?
Well, we have infrastructure such as sewer service. They typically would have septic tanks. They may have county water. We can provide them our city water. We also have our police and fire, where they may currently be getting service from townships and some areas that may be quite outlying, or it may take a while for an ambulance to come to them from Brandon, for example, where we may have ambulance service available very, very nearby. Our snow plowing service, all of the services that we can provide is what they would be looking at getting if they were to annex into the city.
Do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, we call these rural subdivisions typically, which are homes that are built on larger lots. And there are standards for those that they have to meet either through a joint agreement between the city of Sioux Falls and either Lincoln or Minnehaha counties, or depending if they're outside of that joint jurisdictional boundary, it would just be determined by the individual county regulations. But they are typically on rural water. Some may have wells and then septic systems. And so one of the challenges, again, that we're trying to look at in the future is, as we come up against these developments, how do we deal with them as the city continues to surround them in the future?
What is it beneficial, I guess, to the city to bring them in and provide the city sewer, the water, the everything that they need? Is it more beneficial, or is it not, just to leave them as their own entity?
Well, I think in general, it helps for more orderly planning. Obviously, if we don't have pockets around the city, then we can work on the infrastructure and we can take care of the roads and that sort of thing. But the other issue as a policymaker is, to me, it's also a moral and ethical argument. There is a point at which I think it's, as part of the social contract, you should be part of the city if you're benefiting from a lot of its services. If you're surrounded by the city, for example, you've got city roads maybe right in front of your house and it's being plowed and you're not paying taxes yet. So I think at some point there is a moral obligation to come into the city. The question is at what point and how much? How much should it cost? Because that's really been the big challenge, particularly in areas that are already developed. How much infrastructure would they have to put in and how much cost would they have to bear?
Yeah, I think again that what we've been determining with we have a 5-year capital improvement program that's approved by the city council on an annual basis. And as you look out into the future, 3 years, 5 years, and for example, if you're going to be widening a road from 2 lanes to 5 lanes, you might need additional right-of-way, you might need to change driveway locations. That might also include water and sewer infrastructure with that road. So when you're coming up against these unannexed pockets of land or individual parcels of land, how is that going to impact them as well as impacting the city project? That's kind of some of the things that we're also looking at with this process.
There is an annexation task force that has been looking at all of these different issues. Do you want to touch on that a little bit about what is their role and are they coming to any conclusions?
Sure. Yeah, we are 3 city councilors and 4 citizen members that have come together to come up with recommendations to bring to the city council as far as how do we go forward with annexation in the future. This task force cannot make policy, only the city council can. So it will be a report and it will be recommendations, and then the city council would have to turn those into ordinances or policies. And the big thing that we've been struggling with is, again, at what point should we annex? Should we do involuntary annexation? How much should it cost? What is the infrastructure? And what we're kind of coming to is we're coming up with recommendations of the minimum standards. What would you have to come into the city? What would be the agreement? How much, would you have to take out your septic tanks? How big would the roads have to be? Would you have to hook up to the city water? And if so, in what time frame? What the costs would be essentially. And so the administration has brought forward some proposals. And so we're taking those and we're working on formulating that into final recommendations. We're going to have an open house to discuss it, and then we're going to come back again and we're going to take that feedback that we get from the citizens and make some changes, and we'll probably come back with final recommendations or a final report to the city council.
And will those dates be on the city's website?
Yeah, there's a website, siouxfalls.org/annexation. You can go out there. It has a list of all of our public meetings, including the upcoming public meetings and the open house and all of the materials that we've discussed. There's plenty of information out there you can just go out and find.
Okay.
Yeah, the task force was really initiated by the city council, which I think is going to be some real benefit to us, because what we have been telling the council is that when we as the administration go out and meet with these neighborhoods or these property owners and talk about the growth of the city and how it may impact them, we really don't have a good policy to say, okay, here's what potentially could happen to you. Are you going to be annexed on your own? Is the city going to be pursuing that? And if the city did pursue annexation, again, as the councilor is saying, what would be that level of standard or improvement that you would be responsible for? So the policies that are going to be coming out of the task force that will ultimately be reviewed by the council is going to help us answer some of those questions and provide better guidance, not only to us as the city administration, but also to the property owners that are asking the same questions. What's going to happen to us?
Right, and this is nothing new. I mean, the city's been growing and growing and growing for 50 years. Why now do you think it has been most important to get this task force, and is it to make everything more conformed or more regulated, just so that everyone is treated equally?
Well, I think really with the explosive growth of the city, we're just starting to surround a lot of rural subdivisions. And there was an issue with one in particular, one individual homeowner where there was a proposal brought forward, and it created the discussion of, is this the right time? And there was just a lot of questions, and the administration and the council were kind of wrestling with, when is the appropriate time to initiate annexation? And so it was decided that we need to come up with some ground rules so that there's clarity for everyone, the administration, the council, and the citizen.
You know, in the past, again, the city did work with older neighborhoods to get them annexed, places like Orchard Heights, Norton Frolic, Hayward, that people might recognize those names. And in almost all those cases, the neighborhood was looking for something in terms of utility improvements, whether it would be water or sewer. And we took the approach during those discussions that we would bring you in and convert you to a city water, but we would let you keep your rural roads. So you did not have to put in curb and gutter or sidewalk unless you wanted to. And now we're approaching more and more of these maybe smaller developments or more individual property owners that popped up decades ago, but as the city limits have expanded, we're just running into more of these. And we put together a map at the beginning of this process that identified around 60 potential properties that would be impacted or are currently being impacted by the growth of the city limits.
It's important to point out that this was never about discussing an individual subdivision or property about who to annex. This was about setting a general policy. And in fact, as we've worked through this, the administration has recently made the statement that they don't have any planned annexation of a large rural subdivision, a forced annexation. Now, of course, with these recommendations, what we're hoping is that they find it more advantageous and easier for them to come in, and that they will look at voluntary annexation, that they'll see the benefit and they'll see that the cost is less than what it was going to be in the past, and they'll want to come in. And that would be the best for everyone, for these areas to see the benefit of being in the city and to petition it on their own.
Let's talk a little bit about what some of the benefits are versus now that they're in their own development, and what would some of the benefits be if they were annexed into the city? And I think both of you could talk about that.
Well, obviously when you're in the city of Sioux Falls, you pay property taxes, and those property taxes allow you to get the benefits of city police, city fire, all the different city departments that provide services, whether it's inspections or code enforcement or animal control. All the gamut of different things that we provide that are of benefit to property owners and taxpayers. Because again, you look at within our 78 square miles, there's a lot of benefit to the people that are within those corporate limits. And so when we look at comparing that to, fire protection is a big one that we're always concerned about. Typically, rural water systems and wells are not designed to provide fire protection. It's more just domestic use. So if you have a large event, you would have to bring in water to supplement the fire control. That's one thing. Police calls, those kind of things we keep talking about, that we provide good services. Now, people will also discuss that within their rural communities, they can call the sheriff. They, in some cases, have their own snow removal, those kind of things. But there are benefits of being in the city of Sioux Falls.
Well, and depending where you live, when you talk about the sheriff, that's Minnehaha County.
Or Lincoln County, whichever.
Or Lincoln
yes.
County, right. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And that deputy could be anywhere from south of Canton to Del Rapids, right? And it may take a while to get there. Is that one of the concerns that you have?
Yeah, response times. There could be superior response times coming into the city, and for all the things, police, fire, ambulance. So that's a major consideration, and it should be.
And also when you have unannexed areas that are under different ordinances or regulations, for example, if you're not in the city limits, you can shoot off fireworks, you can burn, those kind of things. And you can imagine when you get these pockets that those things could happen, and then we would get more complaints from people that live around there. So it's a whole gamut of issues that we're trying to deal with.
Let's talk a little bit about, you did mention about sidewalks, but one thing, street lights and sump pumps. Let's talk a little bit about that. And right now in those developments, they may not have any light. It might be darker. Could that lead to more crime? What are some of those
obviously,
issues?
Street lights are a safety concern. There's a minimum standard that is put forward for street light, and Public Works would work with that neighborhood as to where they would be placed. And as far as sump pumps, they're not required. If we were to put in a sump pump collection system, which is a special system that the city can put in, the city would put it in at our cost. So the sump pump issue really wouldn't be much of a problem.
Right, and again, it depends on the individual development or area that we're looking at. But I think we understand through this process, because we've heard it from a lot of people, we understand why people chose to live out into the country, and we understand why it wasn't their vote that expanded the city limits to get to them. So we have to try to respect their desire to kind of live in this rural atmosphere. But at the same time, as the city continues to encompass these areas, I think what we're trying to come up with at the end of this process is, as the councilor said, is there some type of a compromise that would allow you to continue your rural quality as much as possible, and not having to convert to a typical city subdivision requirement if you were brought into the city limits.
Yeah, there's a charm and a character to these rural subdivisions, and they're very proud of it, and they moved there for that particular reason, and it just so happens, as a matter of history, that they've been surrounded. So that's essentially what we're trying to figure out, is how can we honor that, where they can preserve that character and kind of keep that thing that they're really proud of, but also come into the city. And that's where some of these standards, where maybe they don't have to do curb and gutter, and they don't have to do sidewalk, and they can have some of those things that they enjoy right now.
Sure. Yeah. Have you been able to look at other cities that have gone through this in the past, maybe Omaha or Des Moines or any, Fargo, how did they deal with the same kind of issues? Because this isn't new just for Sioux Falls, it's everywhere in the country.
Yeah, every state is kind of different because of the state laws that dictate or determine how annexation should work. But yeah, the city of Omaha is dealing with a similar issue where they've got areas that need to be annexed or have been annexed, and then how do you deal with upgrading those improvements? I think one of the things that's probably more unique to Sioux Falls is just, again, as we've said a couple of times already, is just the number of these rural developments that have emerged over the years. And I think we need to also talk that probably about 10 or 15 years ago, we developed different standards with both Lincoln and Minnehaha counties, so that today it would be very difficult to start a new rural subdivision adjacent to the city or adjacent to our future growth area. So we've determined that there's some issues as far as allowing these to continue into the future. And both county commissions have, I think, changed their attitude over the years so that it's a lot more restrictive to start up a rural subdivision than it was back in the earlier decades.
Nobody knows how much the city's going to grow. It seems like forever until you get that 10 miles, and well, here you are.
Right, 10 miles can close up pretty fast.
Right, okay. Well, great. So with the Annexation Task Force meetings, you can find those meetings online at siouxfalls.org. And thank you for joining us. And when we come back, we're going to talk about the election that's going to happen next spring. We'll be back in just a moment.
Mom, what are you doing?
What do you mean?
To-go containers go in the trash. Plastic bottles, jugs, and tubs go in the recycling. See, these other things can be recycled too.
Glass bottles and jars, cans, cardboard, paper, and bagged plastic bags. Just make sure to give containers a light rinse to remove food before putting them in the recycling. Leave these materials out of the recycling bin. Find out how easy it is to recycle. Visit siouxfalls.org/recycle for a guide.
Well, welcome back to Inside Town Hall. If you've ever been interested in public office, it might be your time. Here to talk about the upcoming election this spring is City Councilor Greg Neitzert, and his guest is Tom Greco, the City Clerk. Thanks for joining me. Let's talk about the election. We have a lot of seats on the City Council that are coming up for election.
We do. We have half of the City Council that will be up for election. We have one in the Southeast District and one at-large seat. Both of those will have an incumbent who may be running again, but we're also going to have 2 seats that are going to be vacated. We have the at-large and the Central District, so those are open seats. And on top of that, we also have the mayor's race, and that election will be April 10th, 2018.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about what people need to know if they're interested in running either for the mayor or for City Council in Sioux Falls.
Well, I think the first thing they should do is get to know a little bit more about the council. We have meetings the first, second, and third Tuesday of every month. The other thing is if they're interested, they could certainly go to our website. The City Clerk's office has a great elections page, but they could also call us at 367-8080. And I'm always happy to meet with any potential candidate to sit down and talk about the process because it's not overly complicated, but there are some important things that they need to know going into this.
Sure. And let's talk a little bit about running for office. You sit at some of these meetings and they're talking about sewer and water and lights and infrastructure. Do you have to be an engineer? Do you need to know about sewer and how it works to be able to run for office?
Absolutely not. Councilors come from every walk of life. City staff is wonderful in being a resource to help to educate you, and you can do your homework. We have a staff that will help us. And so it doesn't matter what you do. You just have to love the city and want to give back. And if you do, you should consider running. Something you can do is go to a council meeting. Go sit down and watch one and see how it really operates. Really, we have 2 functions. We set policy and we budget. Those are really the 2 things that we do when it comes down to it.
Let's talk a little bit about what some of the requirements are to run for office if somebody's interested.
Yeah, so if you want to run for office, there are a couple of different requirements that we have by charter and also by ordinance. The key of which is that you're a registered voter within the city, but also that you've lived within the city for the past 6 months leading up to the election. The last thing is if you're running for one of those district seats, you need to be a resident of that particular district. Beyond that, there are no additional requirements.
And of course, is there an age limit or?
Well, it would be you have to be eligible to vote, so at least 18. But beyond that, there are no upper age limits. It's open to those people who meet that criteria.
Talk a little bit about the commitment to running for office.
Sure, it is a technically part-time job, but it can be a little bit more than that at times. It's important to get the blessing of your employer and your family. It's incredibly rewarding, though. You meet so many wonderful people. You see all of the great nonprofits in the city. You get to work with the wonderful city employees. So it's definitely a sacrifice, but it's definitely worth it.
Let's talk a little bit about some of the relationships that you make and the people that you meet while you're either running for office, whether you're campaigning or if you're elected and then you are representing the citizens?
Sure. When I went door to door running for office, it was one of the most rewarding experiences for me. There's so many wonderful people in the community, and they like to talk about their city, and they just have very genuine concerns and just wonderful people. And then as you meet the city employees, the city directors, you find out what great staff we have in the city. As you work on budgeting, you might work with nonprofits who have different concerns, and you find out how many wonderful organizations there are in the city that are doing things for those who need help, many that you didn't know even existed, frankly.
And these are not political races. Talk a little bit about that. It doesn't matter what political party you belong to.
It doesn't. So candidates run for office in the city of Sioux Falls without party designation, so there's not a D or an R behind their name or an I. It's a level playing field in terms of political parties. So I think over the years, what you've seen in political races in Sioux Falls, there's been a good number of candidates that come out for each election. It varies by the particular seat that's open. But again, we do encourage folks, if they're interested, to come and see us and talk through the process.
And there are signature requirements. Let's talk a little bit about the petition itself. What do you need to get? What are some of the paperwork that you have to do?
There's quite a bit of steps you need to take if you're running for office, and there are two components. There's the nomination component, which are the petitions, and I'll talk about that in a moment, but also the campaign finance reporting component. So, of course, in the state of South Dakota, the races are run very openly in terms of the flow of money, and there are certain requirements, especially now, 8 months out from the election, that somebody who's interested in running, or certainly candidates, should be aware of. And again, that's one of those things where they really should come and talk to us, or at least consult the law to understand what those requirements are. But there are reporting requirements associated with the finance aspect. The other piece are those petitions, which allow you to physically get on the ballot. For a district member, somebody running for a council member seat, serving in a district, they require 50 signatures from registered voters residing within that district. If you're running for an at-large position or the mayoral position, you require 200 registered voters from the city.
And do you have any advice for people who might be considering this when they're out getting those petition signatures? I would think you don't want to just get 200 if you need 200.
Yeah, it's always a good idea to get extra. Maybe you get double, or maybe you get 150%. And if you can verify that they're a registered voter, you can do that. You can look that up. And so and ask them the question, are you a registered voter? And make sure you get clarity on that. And especially if you're running in a district, you need to be very careful about who you're getting your signatures from, because they need to be in your district. So it can't be just simply somebody who lives in the city of Sioux Falls. Now, in terms of both the petitions and also the campaign finance, don't let that scare you. The city clerk's office is a wonderful resource. I had never run for office before. They were a wonderful resource. Go down and talk to them. Give them a call. They'll be happy to sit down with you. They'll walk you through the whole process. It's really no problem. They're happy to do it.
And it's important to point out on the nominating petitions that the earliest anyone can circulate them is January 26th of next year. 2018, and they'll all be due no later than 5 p.m. on February 23rd. So there's a small window, but of course between now and that nomination period, and certainly the election, you'll see some campaigning going on.
So right now you're just kind of getting the wheels rolling for people that might be thinking about this.
Absolutely. Yep. They could get started now as far as not collecting petitions, but if they wanted to start thinking about running, they can start laying the groundwork. They can even start to do things such as raising money, as long as they file the required paperwork with the city, and Tom could talk a little bit more about that. And I want to make it clear, running for council particularly, it doesn't have to be a very expensive endeavor. Don't let the money issue scare you. It's not something that you need tens of thousands of dollars to do. So if you're just somebody who cares about the city, go for it.
Yeah, so right now, if you're interested in running, certainly, as we've said it several times, come and talk to us, come and talk to a council member. But in terms of what Councilmember Neitzert was just talking about, the campaign finance aspect, there's a couple components to that. Basically, if you're an individual who's received or made contributions or paid expenses in excess of $500, you have a requirement by state to register with the city. And from there, it creates additional reporting requirements that kick off next year.
Okay. And if you have any questions about that, you can go to the city clerk's page. You can go to siouxfalls.org and find the clerk's page, and you can get all the information on that. Well, that's our time for Inside Town Hall. Thank you both for joining us today.
Thank you.
We'll be back next month.